The meeting opened with that slide deck nobody ever paid attention to, the glossy charts scrolling like a lullaby. I felt the room tighten around me like a fist closing slowly. The chairman cleared his throat, all of it practiced and polite, and said, "We've decided to terminate your employment. Clear out your office immediately." I didn't argue. I smiled politely, folded my hands for a heartbeat, then reached down, packed my jacket into the leather bag at my feet, and walked out without a scene. Their smug expressions were almost comical, faces arranged into little masks of victory. Walking out, I let them believe they'd finished me off. It suited them to think the job was done. The elevator swallowed me and the doors slid shut like a verdict. The hum inside steadied me in a way yelling never could. Grief sat next to calculation in my chest, two old crows that had ridden with me since the funeral. People outside the company thought I was broken. They'd seen me at the memorial. They'd seen the old man's last week smile when he handed me those papers. They imagined pity. They didn't know how that pity can harden into planning. I promised myself Monday would be memorable, not for fireworks or spectacle, but for a slow, inevitable unraveling that left no doubt about who built the foundation they'd been standing on. I went home that night and did what feels like breath to me. I read every note, scanned every envelope, and read the legal language like a prayer. The document transferring 57% of the company to my name didn't look like much on the page, a stack of ink and stamps, but it was heavier than any contract I'd ever moved. I played the sequence over in my head, who signed where, who witnessed, the notary's initials. Every official mark was a small, stubborn refusal to be erased. I slept like a man half awake, the kind of sleep where you rehearse the next day's lines in your head and wake with them still ringing. The next thing I did was call a lawyer. I didn't shout the news from rooftops. I hired a small team, sharp, steady people who could hold a pen like a scalpel. "We need airtight," I told my lawyer. He was practical and quick. He said, "You have the shares, the transfer looks solid, but power doesn't live on paper alone." He was right. A signed page can be ignored if everyone in power chooses to pretend it's invisible. Power lives in recognition, in seats at the table, in the way voices rise and fall in a meeting. I wanted both the paper and the room. I used my access like a key. I started late when the office cleared and the lights were thin. I pulled emails, invoices, old approvals. I traced money through the company's arteries, watched it curve into shell entities, into the pockets of people who smiled and clapped at meetings while they siphoned value out the back door. The chairman's fingerprints were on contracts that routed payments to a vendor owned by his cousin. The procurement director's signature sat beside invoices that made no sense if you knew what materials should cost. I collected each inconsistency like a proof, a small bright stone in a pile that would eventually feel like a landmine. I didn't confront anyone right away. Instead, I built the case quietly, patiently. I cataloged the proofs, timestamped everything, created a narrative that would be impossible to shrug off. My counsel drafted letters and resignation forms that fit the shape of what I wanted to happen. We added the legal language necessary to make the simplest option the most attractive. Walk away now quietly with what little pride you have left, or step into litigation and lose everything. It was a clean choice on paper, and that was deliberate. I watched them for days afterward, seeing cracks where they'd been careful to plaster over. Small slips, a flinch at the sound of my name, an executive who started arriving late to meetings and left more often. They thought they had buried me under ritual and routine. They didn't understand I had time, and time can be more dangerous than a man with a grudge. I let their confidence bloom, let them pretend they were safe, while I sharpened the instruments I'd need. When the shareholders' meeting was scheduled, it felt like the last line in a script I had written with slow, careful strokes. Monday would be memorable, I promised myself again, and this time I meant it in full. I wasn't always the quiet type. I followed a man named David, entrepreneur, early on, back when the firm was a handful of desks and a single tired conference room, and I remember the way he looked at me like I mattered. He didn't hand out compliments, he handed out responsibility. "Don't just obey," he told me once over stale coffee, tapping a page of notes. "Assess, think 2 moves ahead." That sounded like religion to me, and I believed him because he'd built the whole place from scratch, from a regional consulting practice into something that stretched across states. I wasn't naive. I knew loyalty could be a cheap coin, but with him it bought me a place at the table, clients' names, and the kind of trust that comes with being left alone to get things done. I gave him nights. I answered calls at 2 in the morning and rewrote proposals until my eyes blurred. Those hours became my currency. They bought respect from clients, stability for projects, and a reputation inside the company as the one who could be trusted to carry weight without whining about it. "You're steady," David said once, like he was measuring me on a scale only he understood. I learned to move in the gray places between policy and profit, to make judgment calls that nobody else wanted to make. He trusted me with decisions that changed our trajectory, staffing choices, bids, client negotiations. I lived on the breadcrumbs he left and turned them into bread for the company. The board watched us the way animals watch a pair that has found something theirs. Their resentment was thinly veiled and often spilled into office gossip and small, cutting comments in meetings. They resented David leaning on me, resented that he'd put someone like me in positions that tilted power away from them. He's young, they'd mutter, or he thinks he knows better. Their jealousy curdled into disdain. They started to show up with questions that weren't questions, statements dressed as curiosity, emails that read like warnings. They tried to undermine the projects I led by sending alternative plans through other channels, by inserting their allies into reviews and audits. It was messy and petty, and it taught me how plastic authority can be when you let it be. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. David's faith had a cost, though. He was magnetic when he wanted to be, and people misread charisma for competence. The board kept a ledger of slights in their heads and banked on finding a single mistake to justify pulling the lever on him. We were in a room one winter afternoon, snow pushing at the windows, when an acquisition a level above us started to wobble. I had advised caution, and David had listened. We rerouted resources and tightened our bids. "This will pass," he said quietly, looking tired, and I believed him because he'd been right before. But the board liked drama, they liked scapegoats. Their patience wore thin, and patience was a currency I didn't have the power to mint. Then his health folded like bad paper. It was sudden enough that the office hummed with shock and whispered plans, like people rearranging furniture while pretending not to breathe. David withdrew into himself and then into a hospital bed, and the firm watched from a distance as if grief were a spectator sport. In those quiet days, while visitors came and went with casseroles and awkward hugs, David did something small and decisive. He signed a document and handed it to me with those shaking hands. "For the future," he said in a voice so weak I had to lean in, "don't follow orders blindly. Use it when they're ready to bury what we built." He pressed the papers into my hands like a grenade, with the pin half out and a prayer that I wouldn't panic. I learned the weight of that paper the moment it left his fingers. People think control is loud boardroom speeches, press releases, fist thumping. Control is quieter. It's signatures and filings, the kind of things that make a court clerk nod and a bank teller change their tone. You can have 1,000 enemies and still hold power if you have the right forms in the right places. David knew that. He taught me how to read the language of ownership, how to follow a dotted line to a ledger, how to make sure witnesses had been present. He taught me to be patient enough to wait for the time when slights and grievances would stack into an opportunity. I paid him back not with a spectacle but with fidelity to what he'd built. I didn't crow or desk dance in victory. I kept my head down and let the paper do its slow work. But I also learned to listen to the office like it's an animal, find where it limps, where it smells of old mistakes, and follow that scent. The board had been careful, but they were human, they slipped. They funneled money into relatives' companies and folded letters into other letters thinking no one would notice. I noticed. I cataloged. Loyalty isn't blind when it's earned, it sharpens your sight. David had trusted me because he saw something the others didn't, that steady hands can be more dangerous than loud ones. I remembered his last words when I stood outside that meeting room, and I promised myself the same kind of reckoning he had asked me to carry. Monday would be memorable, and I would make sure of it. The sickness hit like a door slammed in your face, sudden, brutal, and loud in all the wrong places. David, entrepreneur, folded inward fast, stopped showing up to the office, and the business kept moving like a machine that doesn't notice when a part goes missing. I moved into his apartment in Charleston because someone had to. He had no family nearby who could handle the paperwork or the nights when his mind would wander. I sat on the couch with a stack of invoices and a lamp, and I watched him sleep and toss and sweat through fevers that made his hands fumble at the sheets. Those nights taught me how thin the line is between being needed and being left. I handled calls, sorted mail, and kept the day-to-day from tipping into chaos. The firm's routines stayed steady on paper, but the people in the office shifted like a flock that had lost its lead. Directors who'd been polite before got sharp around the edges. They started asking questions that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with measurement, where the money came from, who signed what, how decisions had been rooted. They smelled opportunity, and they moved with a smooth, practiced hunger. I ignored the theater. My work was sitting in that apartment, sorting files, rewriting contracts when they needed to be clear, making sure payroll and vendors didn't panic and make mistakes that could be used against us later. Some nights his confusion was bad enough that I would read old memos aloud so his mouth could find the rhythm of normal conversation. He'd look up through the haze, and sometimes he knew me, sometimes he didn't. On a morning when the sea wind had that thin salt taste and the light came in flat, he called me into his study. He was quiet, too quiet, and he looked at me like he knew the shape of something I didn't. He sat at the desk, the old leather chair creaking, and he had a sealed stack of documents on the blotter. His hands were shaking when he reached for them, but his eyes were steady in a way that surprised me. "Sit," he said, and I sat. He pushed the papers toward me and folded his hands around a mug that had long since gone cold. "I need this right," he said. His voice was raw and small. "If I'm not able to run things, I want someone who understands what this place is for, not people who see an accounting trick as a way to get rich. You understand what we built." I looked at him and felt the room pull tight. "I do," I said, because I'd lived it with him through campaigns and late nights and clients who wanted answers they couldn't find anywhere else. He nodded slow, like he was checking that I had it lodged inside me the way he had hoped. He signed the stack with those trembling fingers. The paper read like a map that had been traced carefully. 57% of the company's shares transferred to me in the event of his incapacity. It wasn't dramatic. It was just ink and stamp and a notary's mark, but the way he slid it across the desk felt like the most honest handover he'd ever made. "This keeps the firm's integrity," he said, "not those men with their suits and their soft hands." He coughed, and the cough took a little of his color. "Promise me you'll use it right. Don't let them grind this place into what they want." I slid the papers into my jacket and felt them there like a small, lethal thing. After he signed, there was a hush that wasn't the kind of quiet that happens when you're alone. It was a quiet that felt like agreement between two people who had made hard choices and accepted the weight that would follow. I promised him then, not with fanfare but with a simple "I will." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in days he seemed to find a rhythm in his breath. We both knew this wouldn't be enough by itself. Signatures can be ignored, and kindness can be used against you if you let it. But those documents were a start, a legal fact that could be wielded, provided someone knew how to do it. While I cared for him, I also watched the office. The board's eyes grew colder. I could see them lining up names, whispering about succession, drawing charts that carved the company into parts that could be handed around. They did not understand the language we used with clients, the small ethics that kept deals honest. They saw balance sheets as the only truth. That misunderstanding is what makes people dangerous when they're in charge. David knew that. That's why he put the shares where he did. He wanted someone who would keep the firm's bones intact, who would not let short-term greed hollow it out. There were moments when I thought about walking into the office with the papers in my hand and telling them what he'd done. But David's health was fragile, and spectacle would not have honored him. Instead, I guarded those documents like you keep a secret that can save someone. I kept my days split between making sure he had what he needed and making sure the paper trail at work stayed whole. It was a small, boring devotion, sleeper work that people rarely see, but that's where decisions are actually made. I learned then that power is often a quiet thing, and sometimes the only way to protect a legacy is to sit with it through the small hours and wait for the right time to act. They pulled me back into that same mahogany room like they were closing a book they thought I had finished. The air smelled of old polish and someone else's confidence. The chairman sat at the head like a man who had practiced every line he would need. He offered his smile and his rehearsed civility and said, "We've decided to terminate your employment. Clear out your office immediately." They expected me to break, tears, bargaining, some kind of explosive scene that would let them breathe out triumph. I gave them nothing of the sort. I packed a few things into a leather bag, folded my jacket over my arm, and walked out like a man seeing air after being underground. Their faces held that tiny, painful joy people wear when they think they've punished someone. They leaned into the performance, trading glances as if each glance were proof they'd done the right thing. I let them keep their moment. In their heads, they had fixed the story. David was gone, his loyal man was gone, and power belonged to the polished committee who knew how to make spreadsheets sing. They didn't look at the papers on my person because to them a man carrying a jacket looked harmless. They never read what I had learned to read. A signature is a kind of quiet violence that doesn't announce itself. I went home that day and did something very small and very important. I made certain the transfer was airtight in form and notice. The document had been signed, notarized, witnessed, and filed. That stack of paper David, entrepreneur, had pressed into my hands wasn't a promise, it was a legal fact. I called my lawyer and we ran through every clause as you would run a line for traps. "It's clean," he said, then added, "but documents alone don't make people obey anything. They have to be confronted with consequences." I understood that. I'd spent years learning that authority is not merely the right answer on paper, it's the will to enforce it. The board moved fast after the memorial. They tried to stitch the company back together with their usual stitches, good optics, quick appointments, friendly press. They planned a parade of competence. They thought a week of speaking well and posting polished photos would erase any doubt about who ran things. I watched from the edges, letting their confidence swell like a sail. When they called me in for that meeting, I felt their triumph as if it was a physical thing pressed against my chest. It almost made me laugh. Almost. They had forgotten, or maybe they never knew, that the law moves in its own slow, patient way, and that once a transfer is properly executed, it waits like an animal for a chance to be let loose. I had majority control on paper. They had a fragile consensus in the room and the habit of assuming fate favors whoever gossips loudest. They'd built a small kingdom out of ceremony and habit is brittle if you know exactly where to push. I didn't confront them that day. I let them keep the illusion that they'd finished me. When you plan something that needs patience, you don't burn bridges by shouting across them. Instead, I started at the paperwork again, tracing the details that mattered, who had notice when filings had been received by the Secretary of State, whether the transfer had been recorded in the shareholder ledger. Small things, technical things, but those are the things courts and banks care about when the music stops. I also circled through the company's records, quiet and methodical, checking signatures, following invoices, mapping relationships. What I found while I waited made my jaw set. There were payments rerouted to companies that existed only on paper, procurement lines that bent toward directors' cousins, invoices padded like a coat stuffed for winter. They had been careful, but the kind of careful that assumes nobody will look closely. I did look closely. Each irregularity became a line in a web. If you pull one thread, the fabric comes with it. So I set a plan that was more like a season than a moment. I gathered evidence, built timelines, and talked to people who knew things and would tell me if they thought they could still get a slice. I didn't yell. I didn't storm the offices. I let the law do the heavy lifting and let time show who had actually held the company together. When the shareholders' meeting was scheduled, I showed up not as an interloper, but as the person who owned more than half the company. The shock in their faces when they realized paperwork has teeth is a look I'll not forget. They had theatrical authority, I had legal control. The distinction matters, their power was performance. Mine was reality. Monday, like I promised, would be memorable, and it would be quiet, precise, and absolute. I spent that weekend alone in David's townhouse with a small lamp and a stack of folders that smelled faintly of his aftershave and old paper. The place felt like a shrine and an office at once, all the habits of a man who kept things orderly. I made tea, set a rule for myself. No one disturbs the work until it's done. I opened folder after folder, tracing the chain of custody for the shares like you would trace a wound to find where it started. Signatures, dates, notary stamps, every little formal thing was there, lined up like soldiers. The more I checked, the more certain I became that the transfer wasn't a gesture. It was a legal act, and legal acts can be very loud when you let them be. I called a lawyer in Denver that afternoon. I wanted someone who knew how to be quiet and effective. We need discretion, I told him. He said, you have something the rest of them can't fake, properly executed transfer, but you need a plan. I like that. He wasn't trying to flatter me or to scare me. He laid out what we'd need: certified copies, filings with the state, a clean shareholder ledger, and a preparation for the moment when we would have to show teeth. Possession has its own authority, he said, but people often mistake noise for power. We'll need both paper and presence. I agreed. He assembled a small team, practical attorneys who spoke in short sentences and who didn't mind working nights. Over the next day, I went back through every document with a fine-tooth comb. I matched dates against the notary logs and the Secretary of State's filings. Where a signature looked like it might be a copy, I tracked down the original. When I found a line that wasn't right, I dug until it made sense or until it couldn't be explained. I recorded every email that referenced the transfer, every memo that hinted at succession talks, and I printed a timeline that looked boring until you read it closely. When a pattern appears boring, that's a sign it's working. People have been doing wrong the old-fashioned way, slowly and carefully, thinking that slow makes things invisible. I also knew paper wouldn't humiliate them. I wanted the undoing to sting. That meant making their pride and petty competence feel small, so I layered facts on top of law. I traced money that shouldn't have moved and followed it to places that had names matching board members' relatives. I pulled invoices that had been padded and contracts that had strange middlemen. Each irregularity was plain as daylight if you looked, but collectively they painted a picture of a company being eaten from inside. I built a narrative that didn't need flourish. Numbers plus names, dates next to signatures, a simple story anyone could repeat in plain language to an investor or a court. At night, I would sit in the study and rehearse what I might say if someone asked, because power is often won by the way you explain the obvious. I practiced the line that had to be true. These documents were executed properly. I own a majority. Resignations could be voluntary or they can be forced through litigation. Your choice. I imagined the faces around the table, the way the chairman's jaw would set when the room went quiet, not because of his voice, but because the numbers said otherwise. I didn't rehearse theatrics. I rehearsed clear sentences that left no room for theatrics to hide behind. I also reached out to a few trusted people inside the company, the kind who had been overlooked or given small, steady responsibilities. I didn't threaten them with grand promises. I told them I had documents, that I had lawyers, and that I was not looking for revenge so much as restoration. We keep what matters, I said simply. Their reactions varied: relief, fear, a brittle kind of hope, but they understood what I meant. You don't need to make every ally a lion. Sometimes you need steady hands and people who will follow a clear instruction without needing to be seen doing it later. By Sunday night, I had the dossier together and a team ready for action. The legal papers had been certified and copied. The ledger matched the filings. The evidence of malfeasance was neat enough to hand an investigator and messy enough to make a director sweat. I felt the weight of the documents in my bag like a decision waiting to be enforced. I thought of David in his bed, how he had believed the firm needed someone who would guard its bones, not hollow them out. I promised myself then that I would do it the way he'd wanted: clean, quiet, exact. Monday would be memorable, and this time my memory would be the one that mattered. I started pulling threads the way you undo a sweater, slow, careful, until the whole thing shows where it's been mended and where it's rotten. I sat at David's table with a stack of printed bank statements and a laptop, and I told myself no shortcuts. I followed receipts and routing numbers through months of accounts, and what looked like boring rows of digits began to form a shape you couldn't ignore. The chairman had been clever enough to hide small transfers inside larger ones, but clever isn't the same as invisible. A vendor payment here, a reimbursement there. Move enough little things and you can redirect a river without anyone noticing until the bridge collapses. I found the first obvious line in a procurement packet and then traced it back. The procurement director had set up a shell company that on paper supplied materials nobody could remember buying. I pulled the purchase orders and matched them to delivery notes. The addresses were real, the checks were real, but the prices were grossly padded. I remember thinking, this is petty and precise, and that petty precision is where greed hides best. I printed an invoice that showed a threefold markup and put it on the pile. "How did you miss this?" my lawyer asked when I showed him. I smiled at him and said, "They didn't think anyone would look long enough." Emails were the most honest things. People think paper is the truth, but email keeps the conversations that make paper make sense. I found threads where the chairman congratulated a vendor for smooth handling, and in the same thread their procurement alias thanked him for new business. There were backdated memos meant to create plausible approval timelines, and amended invoices with handwriting that looked like it was trying to be casual. I printed everything and taped the pages into a timeline that, when you followed it, read like a slow recipe for theft. Each item tightened the noose, not with a flourish but with patient stitching. There were moments when I caught myself feeling angry in the quiet hours, and I would remind myself that anger is a poor craftsman. It wants to shout. What I needed was precision. I put together packets by director, by vendor, by date. I labeled them plainly: Chain A, Chain B, procurement payments. I built a map of relationships that showed which accounts fed which people and how the money returned. When I presented the pattern to my legal team, one of them said, "This is clean. This is the kind of thing auditors like." I nodded, because clean is what you want when you drag someone into court. I also started ringing people who mattered quietly: accountants, a former vendor who'd been let go, an internal auditor who had gone quiet after David's illness. "I have questions," I told them simply. "If you tell me what you know, I will make sure it means something." Some answered like they had been waiting, others skirted the edges, scared. One woman, a junior accountant, met me after hours in the lobby and slid me a folder. "They told us to code it this way," she said, then looked at her hands as if she could pull the guilt off them. I thought it was normal. Her face had the kind of weight that tells you when someone has been carrying more than they're meant to hold. I thanked her and told her I wasn't there to humiliate anyone, I was there to stop the machine. Every discovery made the plan clearer. I had time on my side and the patience to make sure nothing could be easily dismissed. They dressed theft in corporate clothes, terms like consulting fees and vendor rebates, but underneath was the same thing: people taking what didn't belong to them. I printed evidence and filed copies with my lawyers. I wasn't building a public spectacle. I was building a set of choices they would understand and fear: resign quietly now or face a long, public unweaving of their reputations and wallets. When you hold the facts and the law together, options get very sharp. By the time Monday arrived, I had a dossier that smelled like plain light. It was not dramatic, it was inevitable. I had the transfers traced, the invoices labeled, the emails that hummed with intent. I felt the papers in my bag like a weight that was finally the right kind of heavy. The men who had thought themselves untouchable had made their world small enough that I could reach in and find the rotten things. All I had to do was show them what I had found and give them the chance to step away. They had built their safety on the assumption no one would look long enough. I had looked long enough. The room smelled like coffee and conditioned air, and the kind of confidence that people wear when they think nothing can surprise them. The quarterly investor meeting was supposed to be their pageant, slides, smiles, talking points polished until they shone. I walked in and felt every eye cut like a blade, like they were measuring me for a role I wasn't meant to play. I set the documents on the table without fanfare, the transfer papers notarized and stamped showing 57% in ink. The paper made a sound against the wood like a verdict. The chairman looked like he had swallowed a hard fact. His smile thinned and his hand flexed on the arm of his chair, but he kept his voice steady enough to be dangerous. "You're not authorized to be here," he said, voice tight as wire. I let the silence hang until it became its own pressure. The investors leaned forward, some fidgeting with pens, others watching us like judges weighing a dispute. I gave them no grand speech. I said simply, "This seat is mine by ownership." I slid copies of the certified transfer across the table so lawyers and investors could see the stamps and the notary mark. People read things differently when ink is right in front of their eyes. The chairman's composure cracked in small ways, an intake of breath, a half-formed sentence that died before it started. He tried the old gambit of distraction, talk about strategy, market share, numbers that glitter without substance. I wasn't interested in noise. Then I began to lay out what I'd found. I took a stack of printed emails and invoices and placed them beside the transfer papers. "This isn't just about a signature," I said. "It's about what has been done while you pretended to steward this company." I started with the simplest things and worked up. A procurement contract sent to a shell company that matched the procurement director, family address, invoices padded by 2, sometimes 3 times the market rate, payments rerouted through accounts with no real business activity. I produced an email thread where the chairman congratulated a vendor for smooth handling, and a follow-up message from an account that only existed on paper. The investors read, and their faces changed the way weather does when a storm moves in. "These are allegations," the chairman snapped, "because accusation needs a louder voice to hold weight." He started to call for order, to insist we follow a plan he had rehearsed with his lawyers. I expected that. I had rehearsed other things too. I handed the chairman copies of bank statements that matched the invoices. I showed ledger entries where money flowed out as vendor payments and reappeared as personal transfers. "People inside the company have records," I told the room. "They will testify to this." The legal team at the table murmured into their devices. Investors began whispering among themselves. A couple of larger stakeholders straightened in their chairs, the way someone does when a risk becomes a real fire in the room. I offered them a choice that was as plain as a crossroads. "You can resign now and divest quietly," I said. "Hand over your shares and walk away with as much dignity as you can muster. Or you can force litigation and these files go public, auditors get involved, and the press gets details that won't be flattering." My voice was quiet, but the room heard it as if it were a bell. The chairman's mouth moved, working to produce an answer. He tried to bargain. "We can do a review," he said. "An internal investigation, give us time." I shook my head. "Internal investigations are what let these schemes fester," I replied. "You had time, this company had time, now you have a choice that suits the gravity of what you've done." One investor from the back, a woman with a hard banker's stare, asked, "If we accept resignations now, will there be confidentiality?" I answered plainly. "Yes, there will be confidentiality and there will be a separation agreement that protects the company and keeps the fallout minimal." Another investor wanted to know if shareholders would be protected. I showed them the transfer certificate again and explained how control would be used to stabilize the firm and correct the finances. The tone in the room shifted from indignation to calculation, because money people think in terms of risk and recovery, not drama. The chairman looked around as if searching for a friendly face. One by one, the directors realized their options were narrowing. The prospect of long, ruinous litigation, subpoenas, and press broke their practiced composure. I watched them sign the resignation forms my counsel had prepared, hands shaking where they'd like to imagine they were steady. The room emptied of the old smugness and filled with something more fragile, the fear of consequences. When the last page was signed, the chairman slid the pen away like a man laying down a weapon he could no longer use. I sat back, not triumphant but clear. The choices had been laid out plainly, and they had chosen to save whatever remained rather than fight to keep what they'd stolen. The investors exhaled. Monday had been memorable, but the real work was only starting. None of them could bear exposure. One by one, they took the pens I slid across the table and signed the resignation and transfer papers we'd prepared. Their hands trembled in ways that used to be invisible behind meetings and polished reports. They had practiced composure for years, so they tried to keep it. It didn't hold. I watched the chairman's face go pale with each name. The procurement director's jaw clicked like a trap closing. Small humiliations moved through the room like ripples, and I kept my face calm because there was work to do even as their world unraveled. It was almost surgical how it happened. I didn't shout. I didn't humiliate them with a speech meant to show off. I laid the facts on the table and let the law and evidence do the rest. Men who had built their lives on optics and soft power found that the simplest documents can undo a reputation. They had counted on networks and nods and the ability to make inconvenient facts disappear under the rug of a quarterly report. I made sure the rug had no roots left to hide under. When the first resignation slid by me and a director left the table without meeting my eyes, I felt the air change. They were choosing damage control over a public trial. They tried small lies, blame a process, blame a misplaced memo, but the facts we brought were precise. Bank transfers matched invoices that no one could explain. Names matched companies that had no staff and no offices, only addresses that were home kitchens. Email chains tied people together with the kind of clarity money can't buy. The investors sat between us like judges. They asked calm questions. Who will stabilize operations? How soon can audits finish? What does the balance sheet look like once we unwind these transfers? Those were the kinds of questions that you answer with planning, not pride. I answered them plainly and with a map. That map made resignation look like the only smart move. When the final pen rested and the last director left the table, their empty chairs felt loud. I looked around the room that had once felt hostile to me and saw it differently. The dark wood, the plaque-heavy walls, the old portraits of women who'd never met the men in that room, all of it suddenly belonged to someone who could use it to set things right. Power had shifted from people who liked flash and pretense to someone who had the patience and the legal authority to hold them accountable. It wasn't vindictive in the way the tabloids imagine revenge. It was precise, clean, and deliberate. I thought of David's final whisper then, the one he managed in that small study before illness took the rest of him. Don't let them win. He had given me something more than a document. He had given me a purpose. I had lived with that purpose through lonely nights of sorting invoices and tracing bank wires. I had felt the weight of his trust like a stone in my pocket. When I pressed the papers across the table at the shareholder meeting, I felt that stone shift into place. I had not let them win. There is a lesson in quiet revenge. People expect drama, shouting in halls, social media storms, the kind of public spectacle that makes people cheer or condemn. That isn't what undoes skilled men who hide their theft in contracts and friendly dinners. They get undone by accuracy, by the slow accumulation of incontrovertible facts. They get undone by a calm person who knows the law and has the patience to wait until the right moment. You don't need noise to break the kind of pride that rests on tiny, repeated lies. You need evidence and the nerve to use it. After the meeting, the firm was messy in a new way, cleaner and scarred. We had work to do that wasn't part of any boardroom theatrics. We had to repair contracts, notify clients, and set a new standard for how business would be done. I didn't feel a child's joy at revenge. I felt the heavy satisfaction of a job completed correctly. The board members who stayed were given choices: cooperate, help rebuild, or litigate and wreck whatever remained. Most chose the first because the alternative was ruinous and public. I sat back in the head chair for a moment and felt the room settle. It wasn't glory, it was duty. Authority finally matched responsibility. I knew that trust would have to be earned again by steady work, not by the thrill of a well-timed reveal. I remembered David's face and the small, fierce way he had handed me the papers. I remembered the nights of coffee and spreadsheets, the sober conversations with quiet lawyers, the careful climbing of a ladder that had been left leaning against a shaking wall. Monday had been more than fun. It had been justice reclaimed in the quietest way I know how. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.